Good day, I am Marilio C. Perez and I will present to you this scientific article from Osman Abdelgader El Faki entitled Effect of Dietary Supplementation of Yeast or Saccharomyces cerevisiae on Performance and Carcass Characteristics of Broiler Chicks. And I will also give critics regarding with this. So let's start. Okay, so here are the contents of our presentation. First is the rationale or the problem. Second is the objectives of the study. Third is the related literature and citations. Fourth is the research methods. Fifth, results. Sixth, conclusion. Seventh, recommendations. And for the last part, I'm going to give my overall critique of this scientific article. Here's the problem of this study. So, increased economic pressure exerted on the cost of production made it essential to get the greatest benefits from every unit of feed, and therefore it became too necessary to seek new suitable sources of feeds. Um, Presented in this article is one of the problems that the researchers attempted to address. The researchers truly did a background check just to state this type of problem, which makes it important enough to justify their study. However, there is no study or any basis to prove this statement. A researcher must have supported evidence according to the writing guides from Indiana University in Bloomington for certain claims because this will make his or her assertions valid and agrees with his or her stances. This can be observed in the study by Mulatu, Ameha, and Girma in 2019. The statements have background or backup studies and supporting pieces of literature. The objectives of this study were to determine the effects of dietary supplementation of yeast Saccharomyces cerevisiae on broiler performance. The objective of this study were testable, however, it does not have any specific parameters to measure, like the feed intake, growth performance, and carcass characteristics of broiler chicks, like in the study by Volatua, Ameha, and Girma in 2019, which has the same specific parameters. It can also add the significant differences which can be seen with the study by Zenarosa and Canciles in 2018, which had this type of objective. And it might be a good thing if this were also added since it is also discussed and answered in this article. I have presented here the three pieces of literature from this article. The first literature is from Scott in 1982, which states that three forms of yeast are commonly used in animal feeding. These are dried yeast, which is a byproduct of the distilling industry, inactivated cells, which are incapable of starting fermentation, and irradiated yeast, which is used for its vitamin D2 content. Brewer's dried yeast is derived from the fermentation of molasses and used in poultry nutrition. Another is from MacDonald et al. In 1988. They said that the protein of yeast is of a high nutritive value and is especially favored for feeding pigs and poultry because of their simple stomach, and it is a valuable source of many B group vitamins and is relatively rich in phosphorus but has a low calcium content. Last, we have from Yadav et al. In 1994. Their results indicate that the average body weight, feed conversion ratio, dressing percentage, heart, gizzard, and liver weights were not significantly affected by degraded levels of yeast supplements. The same workers also found that the nutrient balance in respect of protein, calcium, and phosphorus showed a positive balance in all treated groups, but the differences were not significant. So these reviews of literature are comprehensive and focused on the problem. They include the relevant literature regarding each of the study's variables and are arranged based on the variables and the objectives if you are going to read this scientific article. This part contains primary and secondary sources cited, of course, and the sources are not that latest, but they help the readers to understand the arguments. However, it does not have a theoretical framework. It does not contain an introductory part and the summary of it. I also presented summary of their research methods. The experiment was conducted at the poultry unit of the Faculty of Animal Production in University of Khartoum, carried out in the winter season of from 29th of November 2008 to 3rd of January in 2009. They also checked the temperature of the poultry ranged between the 31 to 35 degrees Celsius and was recorded by Shambat Meteorology Center. They used 200 commercial broiler hybrid strains of chicks and were reared on 16 experimental pens and deep litter in an open-sided house constructed of iron posts, brick walls which is 50 centimeters high, wire netting sides above the walls, corrugated iron sheets of roofing, and a concrete floor. Each pen was equipped with the one flat chick feeding tray for the first few days, and then replaced by a tube feeder. Complete a randomized design is the design they used, which with 10 chicks per pen and 4 replicates per treatment. The birds in each pen were weighed to determine their initial live weight and offered the respective diet ad libitum. At the end of each week, the live weight of the experimental birds in each pen was determined, and the weekly live weight gain was assessed by the difference from that of the previous week. On slaughtering day, 2 birds for each treatment replicate were randomly selected and individually weighed. They were then slaughtered manually, and the carcasses were then eviscerated by ventral cuts, and the visceral contents like lung, heart, gizzard, abdominal fat, spleen, head, liver, neck, leg, intestine, cecum, warm carcass weight, and the cold carcass weight. They were statistically analyzed for the treatment difference by analysis of variance, or the ANOVA, and the software used was the SPSS. And the differences among any treatment means were tested using Duncan's multiple range test. Okay, so the procedures in this article were explained briefly. It is also categorized from general methods to statistical tools they used. The management practices were also discussed in a detailed manner, like how the birds were purchased. The author, the author also gave a brief description of the housing of the animal. It is also explained in this article the schedule of feeding, which is ad libitum, meaning that the feeds are available at all times, no restrictions applied. At the end of the experiment, the researcher will undergo slaughtering to determine the carcass characteristics of the broiler. The contents were eviscerated and the internal organs were weighted. The research design is complete randomized design, of course, and as for the statistical analysis, they used ANOVA, and for the differences among treatments, Duncan's multiple range test is used. And these are the summary of the results. So the first result they revealed is about the total feed consumption, which shows that the highest feed consumption, weighing 3,982.13 grams per bird, was attained by the group of birds fed a diet containing 0.04% of yeast. The highest live weight was attained by the group of Birds fed the diet containing 0.02% of yeast weighing 1,710 grams per bird. The final live weight was attained by the group of birds fed the diet containing 0.02% of yeast, which weighs 2,151.75 grams per bird. And the birds fed the diet containing 0.02% of yeast attained the lowest feed conversion ratio, which is 2.28. There were no significant differences shown in weekly feed intakes during the fourth, sixth, and seventh weeks of the experimental period, except in the fifth week. And during the fifth week, feed consumption was attained by the group of birds fed a diet containing 0.04% dietary yeast weighing 894.38 grams per bird. However, during the last week of experimental feeding, the birds fed the diet containing 0.02% of yeast had significantly higher mean live weight, which weighs about 2,151.75 grams per bird than the birds on the other treatments. And the data showed a weekly increase in the live weight of the experimental birds. So the researcher observed that the feeds contained 0.02% of yeast showed the highest weight gain. The highest gizzard weight is 34.28 grams per bird. The weights of the neck, head, leg, abdominal fat, intestine, heart, lungs, spleen, and intestinal length were not affected by the dietary treatment. The results part were answered based on the variables presented in the objectives. The data analysis was explained and the strategies were justified and described properly. The findings of each variable are clearly described. The findings were also backed up by several studies, which makes the data analysis refined and reliable to substantiate the claims. As for the presentation of the data, the tables used are simple, and it makes the data gathered clearer and understandable for the readers as it equates to the analysis stated in this article. So the conclusion here drew the main point, which indicates the usefulness of this study. However, it does not have any conclusion section that explains the general observations of the researcher. Like the study by Said in 2016, it includes the conclusion section that explains the author's general observation in his study. As for recommendation, this intends for future researchers. This allows those interested in researching this problem to conduct additional study. However, it does not have any recommendation section, and there were no additional recommendations mentioned in this study, just like in the scientific study of Zenarosa and Cancilles in 2018, where they enumerate several recommendations for the other researchers to have a foundation for the study they wanted to focus on. In general, this paper was done very well. It explained how the research was carried out, how the procedures are done, how the data were gathered, and how the data is interpreted in a way that a reader can comprehend based on the presented data. The contents and parts were almost complete and not that confusing. The main results were also pointed out. It clearly explained the claims of this study. Therefore, this study can also be a reliable source for other researchers that wanted to study related to performance and the carcass characteristics of the broilers. And that ends my presentation. Thank you for listening.